Last week we were studying from Leviticus chapter 11, and we talked about clean and unclean foods. And so just to bring us back up to speed real quick, why were there clean and unclean foods? The trick question. Why were there clean and unclean foods? Yeah, why were they?
Just in general, it was part of their rule of living in order to be with God. They had two things. One of the things was knowing the difference, and a lot of it said to be they were ahead of their time back then, knowing what to eat and what not to eat for their health and well-being.
That's good. That's good. That's good. Okay, so there were clean and unclean foods. Why did God give the law about clean and unclean foods? Yes, from that, and that's one of the things I'm going for. So thank you.
God only wanted clean.
He made unclean things. He made unclean things.
He wanted clean things to be sacrificed.
The end of chapter 11, it says something to the effect of, so that you may know or be able to differentiate between the clean and the unclean, between what you can eat and what you can't eat. The law was there so they would know. Is the answer I was actually looking for, but the fact that it was there, we started this class looking at the fact that the Israelites were learning to live with God in their midst. And all throughout this book, we keep coming up on this phrase that says, God is holy, or God is saying, I am holy, you shall be holy. And so all of this is tied into that. And he's giving them, I'm going to say, some rules to live by to help. He's giving them a way. He says, okay, this is what's clean and this is what's unclean. And this is what you do about it. Because there were a lot of things that were unclean that you could not avoid. Now, I think Zach is absolutely right when we're talking about looking at it today, especially. But and we'll look at that in just a few minutes. That when we're thinking about clean and unclean, we're thinking about it from a different standpoint than they were. They were thinking about their body being clean and unclean. It may have represented more, but that's what they were thinking about, because they had to be clean to be in the camp. Let me take that back. They didn't have to be clean to be in the camp, but they couldn't stay unclean and stay in. They had to deal with the uncleanness that they came upon. So, question, what was the result if you ate something unclean, or for the last part of chapter 11, if you came in contact with an unclean body such as a dead animal? Not really. You are unclean for a period of time, generally until the evening or the beginning of the next day is the way they would see it, until evening, which was the beginning of their next day. But think about this for a second. So they became unclean, but did chapter 11 say anything about offering sacrifices for that uncleanness? No, it didn't, which I thought was interesting, and we'll move that along a little bit today as we go along. And I think we need to remember, and not only what we've studied in the past, but what we're going to go over today, It's about being holy as God is holy. It's about God's holiness. And so that's the context that all of this is in. Last week, excuse me, last week we made a note that chewing the cud was interesting because we understand that different from a more scientific standpoint today than they understood it. And there was a good chance that what was being said to them was something that chews well. The food is well digested. And we made the point that, that's kind of like, what are we supposed to chew on? We're chewing on the Word of God. We're supposed to meditate on the Word of God. So there's a little bit of a corollary there. And several people talked to me about that, and I wanted to bring it up one more time because I want to point out that the Bible doesn't make that correlation directly anyway, that I know of. Every once in a while, I find something I don't know. But we can see it. There are some things when we see as shadows or parallels or something like this that the New Testament tells us very specifically about, such as Christ as our high priest. We can say, okay, we can relate that back to the Old Testament. That's a comparison that we're making. Other things, when we come up with ways to look at it, say, well, it may work this way, and that's one of them. And bottom line is we don't know all of the reasons or the specific reasons why some things were clean and unclean, why God put some of these things on the list. We can guess. But in a lot of cases, we're just not told, and the best answer is because God said so. So that's kind of where we are on some of this. So last point on summing up 11, turn over to Mark chapter 7 and starting in verse 14. Because this is kind of an important, we've talked about this verse in various classes over the last little bit, or this passage, I should say. And it's something that means, there's some significant meaning here. And we can understand this better by understanding what they did in the Old Testament. Okay, starting in verse 14, I'm reading from the ESV. And when he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand." This is Jesus speaking. "There is nothing outside a person that going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not into his heart, but into his stomach and is expelled? Thus he declared all food clean." Different versions say that a little differently, but that's what the ESV says. And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All of these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." Now, taking that passage and dropping it in to the Old Testament, you say, wait a minute, this doesn't really correlate real well. Because the Old Testament said, eating this made you unclean. And Jesus said, it's not what goes into your stomach that makes you unclean, because that's passed out. It's purged. What is the difference? Jesus, we know he's not burning up, throwing away, tearing down the Old Testament. He came to fulfill it. So how is his statement different from this one? Jesus, it's real easy to say, well, he's changing the law. But I think what he's changing is the topic of what is clean and what is unclean. Not what causes cleanness and unclean, but what about us is clean and unclean. For instance, I'll get to you in a second. For instance, if we look at it, we see in the Old Testament, they ate foods and they were unclean. They had to wash and do different things at different times for different uncleanness. And Jesus is saying, hey, it's not what you're eating that's making you unclean. He's saying it's what's coming out of your heart. Now, let me ask you a question. What comes out of your heart? What do we feed our heart? Yeah, so what do we fill our lives up with? How do we dwell on things? And you got a big list here. So the concept of, it's an interesting thought that Jesus is saying, hey, it's not what you're eating, but what you're feeding your heart. So it's interesting. Kyle. Yeah, I think a lot of it is understanding God. Can you imagine what it was like for the Israelites that had heard about God? They had seen all the gods of Egypt, and over the years, it kind of dilutes your concept of God. Now all of a sudden, God is here, and He is powerful, and we're rejoicing because He's our God, and He's taking care of us, and He's punishing us, and how do we? And it comes back to how do we live with that perfect being? He's giving them ways and ways to tell. And of course, this is some of the things that carried over from, at the time of this writing, which was not when he was giving it, it was written a little later. But while they were in the wilderness, can you imagine how important it was for them to be clean? We'll get into that a little bit more later, but it's a big deal. And now you take it up to Jesus' time, and it was more about how you washed your hands than being clean. And we're easy to get into that point as well. Who do I tell them you are? And it's so amazing to me that this is so, thinking of it from a human standpoint, we plan things. God says, this is what I'm going to do. And He does it. And He brings the children of Israel to Christ through all of this. It's a plan that He does. It's not something He's planning on doing. It's something He does. Okay, chapter 12. Chapter 12 talks about cleansing after childbirth. And this is one of those things that, this is a normal thing. You cannot, well, I guess you could stop it, but they weren't supposed to stop it. So it's kind of like, why is this making you unclean? And there's lots of different theories about it, but the best thing I've come up on is it has to do with the blood that's involved. Whether it's got to be symbolic. I don't know how else to take it. But once again, we come to the point that, God said it. Oh, I thought you had your hand up, Zach.
Sure. I would say maybe part of it also too is it has to do with death, which is a lot of what
Yeah.
you are God's people and who God is life. And so if you're part of death, it doesn't mean you're sinning. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
But you are touched something as death, thus you need to cleanse yourself before you can kind of be God's people. And I think maybe this has something to do with
And that's as good an explanation as I've heard, read, seen, been told, whatever. I mean, it's like it has to do about God. That's the important thing. So it's only 8 verses long. It's a short chapter. So we're going to read it real quick. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then shall she continue 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of the meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make an atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. Okay. There's some interesting questions that come up out of this. One of them is obviously, what is making it unclean here? And it speaks specifically of the blood, and you will see in chapter 15, I believe it is, where it talks about cycles and things like that. And we're not going to get into that right now. But this is part of being clean and unclean, or preparing yourself to be with God. Interestingly here, and I haven't, once again, you can come up with ideas, but why does a male take less time to be purified than a female? It's literally double, 40 days versus 80 days. 1 week, 2 weeks at the beginning, and then 33 or 66 days. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, people come up with all kinds of stuff. I don't know, but that's what he says. But then we get to an interesting part. It talks about the fact that she's to make sacrifices, a burnt offering and a sin offering. What was the burnt offering for? Let's go back 3 or 4 weeks, or 6 weeks. What was the burnt offering? Why did you make a burnt offering? Well, not specifically relating to this package, but what was the burnt offering for? Why would someone make a burnt offering as compared to all offerings are burnt, but the burnt offering itself? Well, it's partially because God's God. It's like, okay, you are our God. You are the creator. You are holy. This is a offering that we bring to you, type thing. And then it comes up to the sin offering. The sin offering is also called a purification offering. What was purified by the sin offering?
I'd like to know what the sin was.
We'll get there in a second. What was purified by a sin offering? But what they did with it was they took the blood from that sin offering and went inside and sprinkled it on the things in the holy place, on the veil, around about. They were purifying the holy things of God. Now, if you want to take a step into today, you could say, okay, what are the holy things of God today? But that's not where I'm headed right now. So that's what that offering was for. And so your question of what was the sin, the thing was that there was uncleanness. It doesn't say that she went into the the tabernacle. Doesn't say she touched anything that was holy, that she made it unclean. But that's what this offering was really for. So it's almost as if we're making this sin offering because we're trying to make everything perfect for God. We're trying to Be holy like God is. We're setting things aside, keeping them clean. Now, then we get to the atonement part. I have no idea, and actually I don't believe there was actually a sin involved here, Jerry. That was Job. Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of like he still makes an atonement. It says the priest makes an atonement for her. What is an atonement? We went over this a long time ago. Feels like a long time ago anyway. What is atonement? That's, well, sometimes, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like putting things back the way they're supposed to be. Yeah. And here we see that the result of, well, there's a couple of things about this that are really interesting. One is she goes through her time of purification. Who brings the offering to the tent of meeting? That's what it says. It says she shall. Now, I have a funny feeling that as we look at actual practices, we'll see that the family did, because there was a head of the family. But the point is, she brought it. That was what it says. That's what is supposed to happen. So she brings it, and the result is not that her sin is forgiven. The result is that she's clean. Now, having said that, I look at my notes, forgot what I was about to say. Having said that, if you turn over to the result was that she was clean. Now, she had gone through her purification and had entered into the well, not the tent of meeting itself. She'd gone out to the front. She was in the courtyard to get there. You couldn't do that unless you were clean. And yet it says, and she shall be clean. And this is a Hebrew time thing, I think, that we get confused on. They don't think about things quite, or they didn't think about things quite the way we do. We think of, then she shall be clean being, okay, when this is done. This is a process, I think is what it's saying. That as she does these things, then she is clean. And we've got to remember that this really had nothing to do with physical cleanness. It did, but it didn't. This was being holy for God. That's the point. So, if you turn over, let me make sure I'm right in the right spot. If you turn over to Luke chapter 2, we're not going to go read there because I'm running out of time today. Luke chapter 2, we notice that Mary and Joseph did this. After Jesus was born, it specifically says that she went through this process. That's in verses 21 through Luke chapter 2, verses 21 through 24. There's an obvious note here that it's there, they did it. It was still important to the Hebrews. This was not something that had been lessened in importance. It was still important to them. It was still something they did. Now, with that in mind, we also see that Mary and Joseph weren't rich by looking at it because they brought 2 birds instead of the lamb. So that's just a side note. But in the New Testament, as we go through the New Testament, we see that there is this huge struggle over circumcision. Should it be required on the new Christians? And yet this isn't mentioned. Why was it just circumcision that we're really talking, that came up as a big conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles, or the Jews and Christians, or however you want to phrase that. Okay, and I'm going to hang on to that. I think that's a part of it. If you remember, part of what God is doing here is he's separating his people out. He's making them holy. He's making them different. Their food laws are going to show them to be different than the people around them. Their purification rites are going to show them to be different from the nations around them. So why was circumcision such a big deal while this was not? Where did circumcision originate? Abraham. It was part of the covenant that made the Israelites a covenant people with God. And they were told this, you shall do this throughout your generations. It was, this is a Darrell thinks point. It was kind of like, this was a symbol that we're different. And by the time Jesus came around, it was really more of a bragging point than a separation point to make them holy to God. This was more of a, to put it in today's vernacular, I come to church 3 times a week. Yeah, this was a measuring stick for themselves that made them great, rather than obeying God. And that's an attitude adjustment that we need a lot. Okay, today, obviously, the purification laws don't apply. I've never had any children. My wife's never had any children, obviously. But I've watched other people. And I'll let people that have recently had children comment on this. But you know, for the first period of time after the child is born, they seem to be walking around with crossed eyes and tired, and all of their concentration is focused where? Taking care of the baby. Is that wrong? But it does take away from God in a way. In a way, it's like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And in a way, I'm not spending that attention on God. And so that may be part of what is going on here. The concept, not so much of sin, but of separation from God, because he's not in my mind all the time. He's not, I'm not concentrating on that. I'm concentrating on this other thing, whether it be child or work or whatever. So that's a concept we can relate to. Yes, sir. The curse. In pain you shall bear children. It could. Yeah, I don't know. It could. It very well could. And, this law, once again, is put in this section. It seems strange to be here after eating foods, but it's put in this section, and it's in the midst of being pure, being holy. And so we need to understand it from that point and to relate it to us today. I don't think it is that hard, even though we don't have the same physical laws. And if you want to look at some of the other aspects that go along with this chapter 15, and we'll touch on, but we're not going to get to it this week. We'll touch on them probably next week, that have to do with things of this nature. Chapter 15 talks about, I guess the best way of putting it is emissions from the body that defile somebody. And if you watch the wording in Leviticus, defile and unclean are kind of, it's like defile is the process you get there, to get there. And so when Jesus said it's not what goes into the mouth, into the body that defiles somebody, he's specifically talking about clean and unclean. Okay, so, yes, sir.
Just say one thing about, having your first child. I know when I was in that situation, maybe we were more praying about we're not going to mess this up. It's like God definitely in our thoughts, but I fully agree with what you said, though. It is a huge distraction on your ability to just accomplish things, right? Because all the time, everything's invested. But the connection I want to make is, in the Old Testament, we're thinking about these people. Just living life was a defiling experience to them, right?
Yeah.
Everything they were going through, just living their normal lives, they could not stay pure and stay holy.
They could not stay clean, yes.
They could not stay clean, right? And the connection to us now in the New Testament, right? If we're living our lives outside of God, just live, even though we
In the world, not of the world.
yeah, even though we try to be as perfect as we can, we're continually being defiled just by being in this world with unclean people around us. But it's back to what Christ and his sacrifice and his blood, the continual cleansing that we get as Christians, that makes that difference.
And and to take that a step further, when we're talking about our attitudes about it, it's not something I've done, it's something that God does. Yes, sir. Jack. Purification. Yeah. And one of the things I read that talked about possible difference between the male and the female child in that case was that in some cases the male child was less dependent upon the mother, and the father would sometimes take a lot more care of it. Now, I don't know how true that was. That was just something I read. But okay, from that standpoint, that makes sense. Okay, let's move on to the wonderful topic of leprosy. Chapter 13, and I think most of 14. Topic of leprosy. All of my life as a kid, I was taught about leprosy and how it was this terrible disease and your skin would fall off. I still remember one time when I think it was 7th grade, I don't remember, I got cut by a sumac branch. And I had this blister on my arm. And I went around telling me, see, I got leprosy. It looked really, really bad. And, but, as you grow up thinking about that and you read this, and then you come to find out as you study it, it's kind of like the thing with chewing the cud. We think of leprosy different than they think of leprosy. The term in Hebrew, which I really can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try, and the term is translated in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that the people in Jesus' time uses the word lepra. Lepra is the way that's pronounced, lepra. And a leper was leprous, just different type, same word base, but different connotation there. And I think that's where we got the term leprosy from. When we say the word leprosy today, what we are thinking in our heads, what we associate with it is Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease is not, for the most part, what is defined in this chapter. What is defined in this chapter is more, how many of you have ever known somebody that has had leprosy? I haven't. Nobody. How many of you have ever known somebody that's had psoriasis? Psoriasis. Yeah, most of us. Or eczema. Yeah. That's the type of diseases that this is really talking about. Now, when you think of it this way, and another point on this is that from history, we have very little information that says there was Hansen's disease in the Middle East during this time period. It's possible. But if it was there, it was very, very rare. So that takes us to how do we understand this? We need to understand it the way they understood it. We're not going to read all of it because there's a lot of repetition in it. But what it boils down to was there would be a scab or something on your skin that was irregular. And you would say, oops. And you go show it to the priest. And the priest, via the instructions that they had, would look at it and they would say, oh no, that's not this type of disease. So you're still clean. Or they would look at it and they would say, I can't really tell. And in that case, the person would go and be in quarantine for like 7 days and then come back and see it again. And then the priest would either say, I don't remember. I don't think there was a third time. But the priest would say whether that it was clean or it was unclean. If it was clean, then they would wash, and at the end of the day, they would be clean. If it was unclean, and we're going to go read the results of that later, so I'm not going to go in right there. And there were different levels, if you want to call it this. There was kind of a minor level, and then a really serious level. The minor levels were things that they could tell within a few weeks, and you might be cast out of the camp, but it was something you could show the priest, and it was, it was pretty well done. That was it. Now, then there's others that we'll get into that were pretty serious. So, as we think about this, why, other than health reasons, and I do believe that God was helping take care of his people by some of this in health matters and communicable diseases. But what's the big deal with having a scab? I still have a scar/scab from that sumac. What's the big deal? Well, leprosy these types of things were prevalent. Yeah. But it's not, and that's where I started, is it's not the leprosy that we're used to where the skin actually falls off. Now, there are some stages of leprosy that could correlate to some of the symptoms. But the symptoms that are listed in here leave off the vast majority of the major symptoms of Hansen's disease. So that's why most medical people don't believe that this was talking about what we today understand as leprosy. So what they understood as leprosy was more of what we understood as common skin issues. How many of you have had a basal cell carcinoma? That was probably something they checked. They see something like this. What would it be called? How about a flaw? Look at that. That's what I was taught, but I can't find that. Let me put it that way.
Well, there was a colony in.
Okay, once again, leprosy today versus leprosy of their time, how they understood that word. Leprosy today, yeah, that's what happens. But that's not the stuff that's defined in here. Leprosy that we see today is not, for 9/10 of it, is not defined in that list. So from that standpoint, what we consider as leprosy, where the skin's falling off, was not what they were dealing with. Most of the time, I would say. There may be possibility, but most of the time. But what the point I'm trying to get to is, why did God have an issue, other than possible health reasons, which we've talked about? Why did God have an issue with a scab? Yes. It's a blemish. And what kind of animals were sacrificed to God? The ones without blemishes. So you can kind of say, okay, that starts to make a little sense. So there is this connotation. And the Hebrews classified things by how they looked. So that's a part of what's going on here. So we see that going on, and we've been to this verse quite a few times, the first couple of verses in Romans chapter 12. For us, being a living sacrifice, does it say we're supposed to be without spot or blemish? Okay, spiritually. It doesn't actually say that in those verses. It says you're supposed to live holy and acceptable. So the holy could kind of, at least spiritual, it's blemishless, but it's not the physical blemishness that we're talking about. Okay, I want to think about for a minute how the children of Israel, they're wandering in the wilderness now, how they would think about this. What would happen when, oh, I got a scab, I need to go to the priest. What kind of effect would that have on them? To relate to it today, about the only thing I can think of would be when you go to the doctor and she says, that looks like a cancer. It's scary. It's really scary. And, so that's kind of the way I see it. So let's go down to Leviticus chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. Oh, sure. What? Obviously, they seem to have been quite common. That's all I can say. Because this was something, if you think of the New Testament, how many times did you hear it talk about lepers? And, this was something that continued on. This was a issue. How common is psoriasis today? So I would assume it was about the same. Chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let their hair of his head hang loose. He shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean. How long? As long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. I want to stop there just long enough, and since we're at the end of the time here, I'll make this my last point. But this brings a new light to Mark chapter 1, verse 40. A leper came to Jesus, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Notice he did not ask to be made well. He asked to be made clean. Well was just a step to getting clean. The important part was being clean. And there is a lesson in that for us. We need to have that concentration. We need to understand the important thing for Daryl is to be clean. Do I mess up? Sure. But I need to learn to think that way. Not clean by the Old Testament laws, but clean according to Jesus. We've got just about 2 minutes. So questions, comments? The leprosy we know is highly contagious. Once again, what the Bible is calling leprosy is not what we call leprosy today.
We don't even hear it much.
It's still around, but yeah, we don't hear that much of it today. But that's been a big problem in my past, is I understood it to be differently. I understood to see that the leprosy they had was all this people outside the camp and all this, but it would have been a very rare thing. Yes, sir. Skin diseases, yeah. Yes, so I read one comment that says that chapter 13 and 14, describe like 24 different types of skin diseases. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just what somebody wrote in the commentary. But it does cover this great big blanket of things. So when you read leprosy in the Bible, understand they're talking about a skin disease. They're not talking about what we today understand leprosy is. We've redefined that term or made that term fit what we know. Thank you for your comments.